Okay, so you want to take a deep dive into looping and perseveration in ABA therapy. And we are so glad you chose us to be your guide for this. It can be tough, right? Dealing with these behaviors, it can feel like you're going in circles sometimes, both for the individual and the people around them. But don't worry, we're here to break it all down. And I'm joined by, as always, our expert in ABA therapy. Welcome.
Thanks for having me back.
So before we jump into strategies, let's get a clear picture. What does looping look like? What does perseveration look like? Can you define these for us? And why is it important to know the difference?
Absolutely. Yeah, starting with clear definitions is key. So when we say looping, imagine this. A child asks for a snack, right? And you've answered, maybe even offered other things, but they keep asking. That's leaping. They get stuck on that phrase, that question. Perseveration, now that's different. That's more about a really intense focus, on topic and activity, something that goes beyond just like being interested. Picture a child who's fixated on one specific toy, even when it's time to move on. They just can't seem to disengage.
Okay, yeah, those examples are great. Thank you. I get it now. They're different. And I can see how both, in their own ways, could be really tough to deal with day to day. And I'm guessing this is something you see pretty often, especially with kids on the autism spectrum.
You're right on the money. Research actually shows that these repetitive behaviors, which includes both looping and perseveration, they're really common in autism. Something like 70% of children on the spectrum, they show some form of these behaviors.
Wow, 70%, that's a big number, which really highlights why we need to understand these behaviors, right?
Yeah.
And have strategies to help. But before we get into the how-tos, I'm curious, what's going on underneath the surface? What makes these behaviors so common in autism in the first place?
No, that's a great question. And it gets to the heart of why we see these behaviors. A lot of times, looping and perseveration, they aren't meant to be disruptive. It's often coming from a place of needing predictability, needing control, especially in a world that can feel really overwhelming.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, think about it. For individuals with autism who are dealing with sensory sensitivities, right? Challenges with social communication, the world can feel really unpredictable. So these repetitive behaviors, they become a way to self-regulate,
Mm-hmm.
to create some sense of order, maybe even to try to communicate a need.
So it's not about just addressing the behavior on the surface. It's about understanding that why behind it. Like, what's the root cause here?
Yeah.
Which I imagine is super important when it comes to finding strategies that actually make a difference.
Exactly, you hit the nail on the head. If we can figure out what the function of that behavior is it sensory input? Is it escaping a demand? Is it communication? We can tailor our strategies in a much more effective way.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. We got to be detectives, right? Really understand the individual, what's driving this. So speaking of strategies, I know ABA has a ton of techniques, a whole toolbox full of them. Where do we even start? It's like we're standing in front of this giant toolbox, ready to pick out the perfect tool. What's the first one we should grab?
Let's start with visual schedules. Remember how we talked about that need for predictability? Well, visual schedules really tap into that. When a child can actually see the day's events, visually represented, it can really reduce anxiety, make transitions way smoother.
So instead of having a meltdown because they don't know what's coming next,
Yeah.
they can actually see it. That must be so grounding.
Exactly. It takes the guesswork out of it. And the research backs this up in a big way. Studies have actually shown that when you use visual supports, it can increase task completion, get this, by 40%.
40%. That's incredible, just from adding a visual.
Yeah, it's because when a child understands that sequence of events, they're more likely to move through their day without putting up a fight.
Okay, 40%, that's huge. What other kind of visual tools do we have?
Another good one first then, boards. This one really clarifies the order of things visually. It makes it super clear this needs to happen first. And then you get this other thing, which is usually something they enjoy. So it's especially useful for those times when a child really doesn't want to transition away from whatever they're doing.
So it's like first we brush our teeth, then we get to read a book. It makes that transition less bumpy, right?
Exactly. And when something feels more manageable, it's less likely to set off those anxieties, and therefore less likely to trigger the repetitive behaviors. And you know what? Studies have shown that these first-then boards, they can actually reduce resistance to changes in routine by almost 50%.
Wow, 50% just from that visual clarity. That's wild. And I bet this is something you can use anywhere, not just at home.
You're right. Visual supports are super adaptable. You can use them in so many places. But sometimes visuals aren't enough. Sometimes you need to provide more direct support. That's where prompting techniques come into play.
Okay, prompting techniques, what are those?
So prompting is about gently guiding the child towards a behavior we want to see. And you can do this with verbal cues, physical cues, or both. Like, let's say a child is stuck in that looping pattern, same question over and over. You might gently say something like, let's check our schedule. Remember what comes next. It's like a little nudge, but in a supportive way. Not forcing them, more like reminding them.
Exactly. And it does take practice. You're right. You need patience. You have to observe, learn how to prompt effectively. But when you do it consistently with sensitivity, prompting can be really powerful. Research shows it can improve task focus, reduce perseveration, up to 65% of the time.
65%, that's amazing. So prompting can help break those cycles and then hopefully create space for new things, new learning. But what about those times when they're really stuck? Like even with prompting, it's not working. What do you do then?
You're right. Sometimes you need a totally different approach.
Yeah.
And one of the most effective things you can do is offer choices.
Because it gives them back some control.
Exactly. They're not just being told what to do. They're part of the process. And that can make all the difference. Studies have even shown that when you include choice making, you can see a 30% increase in engagement.
That makes sense. It's so much more motivating when you have...
Instead of saying, like, put your shoes on, we have to go, you could say, do you want to wear the red shoes or the blue shoes?
Perfect example. And you know, sometimes even with all these tools, the visuals, the choices, sometimes the kid just needs a break. That's where scheduled breaks come in.
So it's not just about what we're doing, it's about when and for how long.
You got it. It's like hitting the pause button, letting them reset and recharge.
Especially important for kids with those sensory sensitivities we talked about.
Absolutely. They need that time to decompress.
So they can come back refreshed and ready.
Exactly. And research shows that scheduled breaks can actually reduce looping by 45%.
Another big percentage. It's amazing how much of a difference these simple things can make.
They really can.
So it's crucial to tune in to those sensory needs, build those breaks right into the day. What about in the moment, though? When the looping, the perseveration, it just pops up out of nowhere. What can you do right then and there to help?
That's when you bring out redirecting. Gently shift their focus away from the repetitive behavior and onto something new, a different activity, a different topic.
So you have to kind of have those redirecting activities ready to go, things you know they'll be interested in.
Exactly. You got to be prepared. And when you pair redirecting with something positive, like praise, or a small reward for shifting gears, it can be super effective. Studies show a success rate of about 60%.
60%, that's pretty high.
It is.
But it sounds like it takes a lot of energy, being that on top of things.
It does require consistency, for sure. And speaking of things that require some planning ahead, we can't forget about social stories.
Oh, right. Social stories. We touched on those earlier. Can you remind us what those are all about?
Sure.
I remember they're really helpful.
They are. Social stories are basically personalized stories. They help someone understand a social situation, how to navigate it, especially those situations that might trigger the looping or the perseveration.
So if a child tends to get stuck on a topic, a phrase, something like that, a social story can help them learn different ways to handle that.
Exactly. It's like giving them a roadmap for these tricky social moments. And studies have shown that they can improve understanding of social cues by 35%.
35%. That's incredible. So social stories are about giving them the tools to navigate those situations successfully.
Wow, we've covered so much today. We've got visual supports, prompting, choice-making, breaks, redirecting, social stories. Our ABA toolbox is overflowing. But I have to ask, is there anything else, any other must-have tools we should know about? I mean, we've talked about so many strategies: visual supports, prompting, offering choices, those scheduled breaks, redirecting their attention, social stories. It's a lot to keep track of. But I guess just knowing the strategies isn't enough, is it? You need to know how to actually use them, right, in the real world.
You got it. It's like having a whole bunch of tools, but no idea which one to use for what.
Exactly.
You need the right tool for the job. And more importantly, you need to know how to adjust those tools for the individual child. So how do we do that? How do we go beyond that one-size-fits-all approach?
Well, it all starts with observation. You really got to pay attention, be a detective. What's triggering the looping or the perseveration? What seems to help? How does this child communicate in general? Are they trying to get out of something? Are they looking for sensory input? Are they trying to tell you something specific but just don't have the words?
So you really are like a detective looking for clues.
Exactly.
And once you start to piece those clues together, then you can choose the best tools for that situation, for that child.
You got it. And don't be afraid to try things out. Experiment a bit. What works for one child might not work for another. That's okay. It's about finding what clicks for them, what they respond to.
That makes me think about the sensory stuff we talked about. Can you give us an example of how that might play a role, like how sensory needs can actually influence looping and perseveration?
Absolutely. So let's say you have a child who's constantly flapping their hands, or maybe they're making these repetitive noises. Now, it might look like stimming, which it very well could be, but it could also be that they're trying to fulfill a sensory need. Maybe they need that specific input.
I see.
So in that case, if you can provide other ways to meet that need, like a weighted blanket or one of those fidget toys, you might see those repetitive behaviors decrease.
So it's about recognizing that the behavior itself is a form of communication.
Exactly.
It's their way of trying to self-regulate or tell us what they need.
Right. And once you understand that, you can approach the whole situation with so much more empathy.
That is so important.
Instead of just trying to make it stop, you can focus on providing support, teaching them other ways to get those needs met.
That's such a good point. And it makes me realize there's always more to learn.
Always.
So as we wrap up our deep dive here, is there one final thought you can leave us with? Something maybe we didn't get to explicitly, but is worth thinking about?
That's a good one. I would say never underestimate the power of connection. I know we've talked about strategies and techniques, and those are super important, don't get me wrong, but the foundation for all of that, for any kind of support, is a strong, trusting relationship.
That's such an important reminder.
It is.
It's not just about changing behavior. It's about connecting with a child as a person,
Exactly.
understanding their world, building that trust.
When a child feels safe, when they feel seen and understood, that's when they can really thrive.
I love that. This has been an incredible conversation, so insightful. Thank you.
My pleasure, anytime.
I know our listeners are going to get so much out of this.
I hope so.
They'll be ready to support their loved ones in a whole new way.
That's what I like to hear.
And to our listeners, thank you for joining us for this deep dive. We hope you found it helpful and eye-opening. Until next time, keep asking those questions, and we'll be here to help you find the answers.